Well, good morning to everyone. It's good to see you. We're going to continue our study of the Old Testament survey. I'm quite sure that Dwayne had in mind when we started this to finish it in a quarter, but I can't do it. I just can't do it. Well, first of all, I gave you some homework last week, and I know some of you did it. The homework was that we have two areas, two caves that David took refuge in. We also have two psalms that were written from a cave. So I ask everyone to take a look at it and see if you could decide which psalm was written from which cave. I did that because the first cave that David took refuge in, his family joined him, and some of his, beginning of his army joined him, had a number of soldiers join him in that cave. So there were some good things happen in that cave. The second cave was where David was in the back of the cave and Saul was in the front of the cave. David actually cut a piece of cloth out of his, whatever it was, I don't remember, and spared Saul's life. So, do you two want to share your thoughts on that? Did anyone else look at it? You did? Which cave do you think was which psalm?
I don't know. I looked at it after the last.
You looked at it? Well, Ken asked me Sunday night if there was a real answer to that question. And the real answer is no, because we don't know that that's the only two caves that he ever took refuge in. But to me, Psalm 142 has a little bit of good news in it. So I think if I had to force fit the two, Psalm 142 goes in the first cave, which is in chapter 22. But is that real? I don't know. But if you took a look at it, you know more about what David was thinking and his mental attitude during this process. Okay. Would you bow with me? Father, we come before you this morning. We're thankful for yet another opportunity to study your word. And Father, help us that we can look at this and learn far more about your nature, about your will for us, and how you developed a nation that was going to result in having a Savior for us. We give you thanks for that, and be with us in that study. And it's through Jesus that we pray. Amen. Okay, we are still in the process of looking at David's life as he's fleeing from Saul, but I want to begin this morning and look a little bit beyond that and set up a question for you, another question. Of course, David is going to establish his kingdom, and it's going to be the bright spot for God's people throughout all of the time. They're going to have control over their own destiny as a nation, as a group of people. But it's not going to last all that long. And I want to look at the end of that. The next thing that's going to happen is going to be the division of the people. And I want to look at that. 2 Chronicles chapter 10. And Rehoboam went to Shechem. Rehoboam is certainly Solomon's son that's going to be the king of the southern group. He'd gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam, who's going to be the leader of the northern tribes, heard it, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, that Jeroboam returned from Egypt. They sent for him, called him, and Jeroboam and all Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. I want you to think about that heavy yoke that Solomon put on the people. Look at it in terms of, was it the same for everyone? Did he put the same taxation, the same labor requirements on all of the people, or did one of them, or did some of them, namely Judah, receive preferential treatment? Not only in terms of the taxation, but how the treasury was spent. Take a look at that. I don't think we'll get there this morning, but if we don't, take a look at that and think about it for next week. There's going to be some material early in 1 Kings that talk about that. If you do decide to take a look at it, look at the administrative divisions that Solomon set up for taxation purposes. He's going to develop 12 different areas. Each one of them take a month at a time to supply his needs, the palace's needs. Look at it and see if you think Judah was included in that. Okay. We're going to go back now to 1 Samuel chapter 26. Actually 27. In 1 Samuel 26, or 1 Samuel chapter 27, David is still in flight from Saul. He's going to go to the Philistines, and this is his second time to seek refuge in Gath, in the Philistine area. The first time that he was there, he faked insanity to be able to escape. He comes a second time, and look at verse 5. David said to Achish, If I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months. David found a rather unique way to ingratiate himself with the Philistines. He and his men went up and raided the Geshites, Girzites, and the Amalekites. For these nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old. He is raiding territory that was occupied by the indigenous people that the Israelites were trying to dislodge. That was their charge. But he was telling the king, verse 9, whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, and the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. But then he would tell the king that he was raiding the southern area of Judah The Jerahmeelites are the southern area of the Kenites. He would tell the king that he was raiding the Israelites, when in reality he was raiding the enemy of the Israelites. So he ingratiated himself with the Philistine king, so that when the Philistine king was preparing to go to war, he asked David to join him. He was going to go to war against the Israelites, and he asked David to join him. And that's in chapter 28. That the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." So David is preparing to do that. He is preparing to join now. What would he have done had he ever joined that army and gathered in fight? It's a question we can ask ourselves, but we don't know. We looked at this, the next event that's recorded in chapter 28. Saul realizes that the Philistines are gathering, that there's going to be a major battle. He can't get any of his regular sources, either the prophets, the mediums. They won't work with him. They won't give him the information that he wants to know about this battle. So he consults the woman who was a medium in Endor. She gives him an audience with Samuel. She conjures up Samuel in some shape or form. Samuel tells Saul that the end is near, that yes, there's going to be a battle, that he and his sons are not going to survive the battle. So that sets the stage. Chapter 29. When many of the Philistines see that David is joining, they object. So David is ultimately sent home. So he does not join them in the battle. But when he gets home, he finds that his area, his hometown, has been attacked. All of his family has been taken away. Chapter 30, verse 2. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. David consults God. God tells him to go after them. They rescue their family, and all is well. Verse 26 has an interesting comment. 1 Samuel 30, verse 26. Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." David has never stopped trying to be a leader for the Israelites. Even at this point, with Saul chasing after him, trying to kill him at every turn, he is still trying to do good things for the Israelite people. He sends them some of the spoils that he's taken from the Amalekites. 1 Samuel ends with the death of Saul and his 3 sons. We pick up the story of David's life in 2 Samuel, and it's going to be more of the rise of David as a leader. It's going to show us the pinnacle of success. David literally subjugates all of the territory between the Nile River and Euphrates. A huge swath of land, even more than what was originally given to the 12 tribes. We're going to see David as a tragic character. We're going to see him as a success in many, many ways. But in his family life, it's going to be utter disaster. If you talk to a Jew today, what they're looking for is a leader on the order of David to bring them back to the political prominence that they had during the time of David. First Chronicles will also give us a lot of detail related to David. Second Samuel gives us more of the success and failures of David. First Chronicles deals more with presenting him as a faithful, and it emphasizes David's faithfulness over his warlike character. It's interesting that 2 Samuel is named after the prophet Samuel, even though he does not appear in the book. That's related to the fact that it wasn't divided at the time it was originally written. And it covers the period from the death of Saul in 1010 BC to the end of David's career in 970. Covers about 40 years of David's life. Okay. It begins certainly with David. The book begins with David receiving notice that Saul and Jonathan, his friend, were dead. He has the person who brings him that news put to death. In chapter 2, verse 1, it happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" The Lord said to him, "Go up. Where shall I go?" And he said, "To Hebron." He took his 2 wives and went to Hebron. Verse 4, then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And we're going to see that Judah and the rest of the tribes, or the remainder of the tribes, don't recognize David for several years. The first thing that David has got to do to consolidate his power is to consolidate those tribes before he can go out anywhere else. And that's going to be very much the task that he has throughout much of this book. Samuel was anointed king earlier, but it was pretty much of a private ceremony. This is the first recognition of David as king, and it's only of Judah. Verse 8, chapter 2. But Abner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king. There is a king made over the remainder of the tribes. And there's going to be war. Pay special attention to the name Abner, because Abner is going to, I guess in many ways we can call him a kingmaker. He's going to be responsible for the northern army, and he's going to keep this king in power for a few years. Look at verse 11. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So he has a headquarters in Hebron for a total of 7 years out of his 40-year reign. Then he's going to capture Jerusalem and make his headquarters in Jerusalem. Verse 12 begins the war between Israel and Judah. Verse 15, so they arose and went over by number, 12 for Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Apparently it was quite common for armies at that day to have either individuals or groups, small groups like this, 12 of each, to do battle. What I've read is that the winner did not determine the winner of the war. It simply determined which god was the most powerful. Then the sides could determine whether they wanted to have a full battle or not. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I can't think of any other reason that you would have 12 of your best people get up and kill each other. After this, after the 12, then there is a battle. There's apparently it's more of a running battle than a pitched one army just charging another. And in verse 30, Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men, plus Ashel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360. So David's army here certainly prevailed over the northern tribes. Chapter 3, now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Verse 2 begins one of the strange stories, I guess, of David. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Ammon, the Jezreelite. His second, Chelah by Abigail, the widow of Nabal. The third, Absalom, the son of Micah, the daughter of Talmai. And we're getting into, from here on, we're going to have wives that we haven't heard about before. We only know of the three, Michael, and then the two early ones. We're going to have Adonijah, Shephaniah. David is going to have numbers of wives. Let's go to Deuteronomy 17. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I think it's worth reminding. Deuteronomy 17, beginning in 14. When you come to the land which the Lord your God has given you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Certainly this is a prophecy that we're seeing fulfilled. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart shall turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. The things that are mentioned there that David does not transgress, Solomon certainly does. We have here just a very few prohibitions against kings. One of them is multiple wives. David has many. Solomon has more. This is also the beginning of political marriages. And we'll see both David and Solomon do that several times, where they will take a wife from an adversary, thereby cementing a compact of no war between the two. We'll see that a lot. Verse 6 of chapter 3, 2 Samuel. Now it was so while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. Abner is becoming stronger and stronger. Ishbosheth accuses Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines. Abner takes offense at that. Verse 8, then Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? And whether that's the reason or not, but Abner reaches out to David. Verse 12, Abner sent messages on his behalf to David saying, whose is this land? Saying also, make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you and bring all Israel to you. Abner reaches out and says, let's get together. If you'll make a covenant with me, I will bring the remainder of Israel. David likes that. He makes this concession or demand. So David sent, verse 14, David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal. You remember early on, Saul was given David was given Saul's daughter, Micah, as one of his wives. It was his first wife. So he's asking here for her to be returned. That occurs. They have a meeting, and it looks like things are going well. Abner leaves. Joab, David's commander, hears of this. He catches up to Joab and kills him. That does not sit well with David. Verse 31. Then David said to Joab and all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, gird yourself with sackcloth, and mourn for Abner. And King David followed the coffin. So they buried Abner in Hebron. Okay. Tim, can I prevail upon you here? You're such a good guy. I have one in the back.
Thank you. You know, the killing of Abner was a shameful act, especially the way it was done, as it was done from...
I'm sorry, I'm not catching that.
I'm saying, I try to do my best here. The killing of Abner was a shameful act on behalf of Joab. But the reason for it is found in the second chapter, because Asahel was killed by Abner. Abner told Asahel, who was the brother of Joab, don't go away. I don't want to have to face your brother with killing you. And Abishai was trying to make a name for himself, and he went up there, and Abner killed him, because Abner was a powerful man. And so this left a bad blood between the two of them. So when Joab had the opportunity, he killed him. Joab would do a lot of other things for David, but eventually it would catch up to him what he did.
Yeah.
But the reason for his murder, and that's what I would call it,
Yeah, you're right.
is found in the 2nd chapter in the killing of Abishai.
Yeah. And to follow up a little bit on what Ralph was saying, Joab is a powerful, powerful character in the life of David. Joab winds up being killed by Solomon's hand. And we'll see as we go through here a number of things that Joab is charged with that displeases David. But he also does a number of things to save David. Okay, the next thing that I want to pick up on is in chapter 4, is that Ishbosheth is murdered. So they are left without a king. Chapter 4, verse 8, and they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life, and the Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, on this day of Saul and his descendants. These people that brought word to David are also executed. It's a routine, I suppose, that we'll see frequently. Ishbosheth was considered by David to be, almost an equal. He did not want to see it end in that way. Verse 12, so David commanded the young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool in Hebron. But that does leave the territory wide open for David. Chapter 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, indeed, we are your bone and flesh. David was 30 years old, verse 4, when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. The first thing that he does is, or the first thing that's recorded here in 2 Samuel, is that he takes Jerusalem, and he begins to set that up as his headquarters. I have a question in my head is this a positive thing or a negative thing that the headquarters are made in Jerusalem? Certainly as we go through the Old Testament, Jerusalem becomes the center of all political and religious life. The negative is that it still was not a central location, particularly for the extended northern tribes. I think we'll see some occasions where, I don't know how serious, but they are not really happy at having to make that long journey year after year. But it also begins David's recognition by outside people as being someone to reckon with. Verse 11 of chapter 5, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, cedar trees, carpenters, and masons, and they built David a house. Verse 13, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron. Also, more sons and daughters were born to David. Now these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem. I'm not going to go through all of those because I can't pronounce them, but it does include Solomon. Solomon was born in Hebron. I want to go to 1 Chronicles. There are two more names that are given. This list is given with two additional names, Nogath and Eliphalet. But we see here David taking more wives, more sons. The Philistines hear that David has been anointed king over Israel, and they began to take him more seriously. So they began to gather an army. And in verse 17, Philistines heard they had anointed David king over Israel. All the Philistines went up to search for David. David heard of it and went down to the strongholds. So they have their armies gathered together, and God tells David that, verse 19, so David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into your hand. We actually have a couple of battles mentioned here, and David won. The Philistines were defeated again. In chapter 6, David is bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And we know, I think it's a familiar story to all of us, that they decide to bring it up, and instead of using the routine given by God when the tabernacle was built, there were instructions for moving all of the furnishings. They didn't do that, so they set the ark of God on a new cart. And we know that the ark started to move around. A couple of guys took hold of it. And verse 7, then the anger of the Lord was roused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. And he was afraid, and he wondered how it could come from me. So David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David, but he took it to the house of Obed-Edom. Obed-Edom was blessed by having it, and then David was told about that, so he made another attempt and brought the ark into Jerusalem. Look at verse 16 of chapter 6. Now, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, she has been restored to him, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Think about the changes that have occurred in really the two of them since they were first man and wife. They were both young. David was not the person that he is now. He's not had all of the challenges to survive Saul's attempts to kill him. He has not had all of these challenges put before him about trying to unite the people. He's a different person. She's a different person. Several years have gone by. She despised him in her heart. Verse 20, David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants, and as one of those base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel." And remember when they were together early on, that Michal chose David over her father. She would inform David of some of Saul's plans. "Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor." Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Kind of a sad ending. Sad ending. Chapter 7 is God's covenant with David, and it's summarized in verse 16. "And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever." That is the promise that God has made to David. Chapter 8. It lists additional conquest of David, and this is outside the tribal areas. The Philistines, the Moabites. Verse 3, "David also defeated Hadazer, the son of Rehob, son of Zoab, as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates." It's a huge chunk of land to connect to the tribal areas. When the Syrians, verse 5, "When the Syrians came to help that king, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians." Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Verse 9, "When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadazer, he sent his son to King David to greet and bless him." This place is 100 miles northeast of Damascus. Huge chunks of land that are either under direct control or giving tribute to David. Verse 13, "David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. He also put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went." Edom is unique. I don't know of any other place where there is such an emphasis placed on putting garrisons on conquered land. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom, he put garrisons. Why? Why would that be such an important place to fortify Edom? Give you two thoughts. One is that Edom is to the south, buffers between Egypt and Judah. Another one that's a little bit interesting is that, we made a point of talking about the Philistines having ironworking skills that the Israelites do not have. If we look at 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 3, part of the material that David is getting for his construction projects are nails. So they have developed the technique of working iron. But that's only part of the equation, okay? If you know how to work iron, But you got to have the material. Edom has iron and copper mines. Now, that's not in the Bible, okay? But it certainly makes that a very valuable piece of property. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this. Chapter 11 is the story of David and Bathsheba. I think we all were familiar with that. When Nathan confronts David with his story about the rich man, poor man, and the poor man had the lamb, rich man took it. When Nathan tells David that he is that man, verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. It's one of the things that's common to the story of David. When confronted with wrongdoing, he doesn't make excuses. He takes responsibility and repents. We also see that when he's confronted with a major decision, such as going to battle, he almost always asks God, should he go or should he stay? Chapter 12, verse 24, Solomon is born. Chapter 13 really begins the story of David's personal problems. He has 3 children. There's 3 involved in this story. There's certainly more than that. Absalom, Tamar, and Amnon. Tamar is a beautiful daughter. She is violated by her brother Amnon. Absalom kills Amnon. There's a lot to that story, but that is one of the personal tragedies that David confronts. Absalom turns out to be a contender for the throne. Because of that murder, he is exiled for a period of time. Abner talks to David, has a woman go to David, tell him a story. David then allows Absalom to return to Jerusalem. Absalom has a technique of ingratiating himself to the people. He would sit outside the gate of Jerusalem, and when people came in with a lawsuit or a grievance of some sort, he would befriend them and say, well, there's no one available now, but if I were king, there would be. So he uses that to develop a following. He asks David for permission to leave Jerusalem. He goes out, spends a period of time really developing an army to take the throne. David hears about this and he leaves. He leaves Jerusalem because he is afraid of what's going to happen. Ultimately, there is a battle between the followers of David and the followers of Absalom. Absalom is killed by Joab. It's another one of those negatives that goes against Joab in the final accounting. Okay, I realize we went through that. We went through that quickly this morning, but David does retain the throne, but we'll see more problems next week.